doing today? We are welcoming back Dr. Chris Burgwald.
I feel like I was just here.
Just here. You haven't been, we were just talking, you haven't been on Catholic Views just by yourself for a little while.
No.
So it's been almost a year, I think, when I looked back.
No.
Yeah, because you were on with Father Scott for something.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Yeah, but it hasn't been just you.
It has been just me with the guest when I had to pitch hit for you when you were out sick.
Oh, that's true.
This winter, I think,
that was
spring,
like February. Yeah.
Yeah.
It was a good thing.
But so you're right. I have not been the sole guest.
Right, for a little while.
I didn't realize. Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is going to be a good show. I wanted Dr. Burgwald to come in.
Yeah. So you decide to. It's been a year, and you want to.
We need a controversial subject to talk about. So I've been hearing on Catholic radio and on a few different things, just some more comments and questions about why women can't be priests. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I think we should talk about this on Catholic Views so we can understand why it is the way it is and how we should feel about it. How about that?
Yeah. Yeah. So why not just
why not?
I don't know. That's the. Sorry. Go ahead.
No. I don't know how you want to start. But to me, it seems like we should start with, like, is it a dogma or a doctrine, and can it be changed? Where did this all come from? So, wherever you think is best to start, I'm good with that.
So I think that's a good place to start. As a prefatory remark, I don't know that this is the most controversial teaching of the church for the modern era, but it is definitely one of them. And it's been more to be honest, I feel like it was more controversial in the 80s and 90s. People still disagree with it, but there hasn't been as much. Even though, as you said, you hear about Catholic radio from time to time. Back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of conversation around this, a lot of questions. I don't know if I should say there's a big push, because that kind of politicizes the church in a way that's just not real. But like a lot of people asking for this. Right. For women to be ordained as priests.
And it seems like it's happening again in Germany.
With
some of the German bishops. So some of that,
that's true.
I think some of that is bringing this back up.
It's probably true.
In a different way.
And to be honest, I don't know that's ever gone away in Germany. I remember when I was, I did a study abroad in Austria in the mid-90s during college. And in the German-speaking nations, there were a number of different groups that were advocating for a whole number of changes in church teaching. One of them was this.
This is where Martin Luther started his.
But Joseph Ratzinger also.
I know, but it seems like if there's going to be some sort of changes desired or some sort of push, it often emanates from the Germans. Now, I don't want to go off on a tangent about that.
Yeah, you're bad mouthing the Germans, but let's not talk about that anymore. Thanks a lot.
Just gonna drop
Dr.
that bomb
Chris
and then walk away.
Jeez. So, walking away from that bomb.
Back to the topic.
So actually, I think in sort of where you were going with the question, before doctrine versus dogma, I think it's important to make another distinction. Doctrines in the church versus practices in the church. Because this is kind of behind the question that many Catholics have about, can this change? Why can't it change? That sort of thing. So in the church, there are a number of distinctions we make, but one of them is between the formal teachings of the church, called doctrines, and that's the big. And within doctrines, there's different levels of doctrines. We'll get to that, I'm sure, in a little while. So there's teachings, the doctrines. This is what we believe by faith. But then there's the practices, and the practices are things that can almost always be changed, because not all of them, but a lot of them are just human in origin,
and that includes celibacy, correct?
Yeah,
is actually a practice, not a doctrine.
Practice, yes. So the idea of a celibate priesthood is not a technically, it's a teaching. It's not a teaching of the church. It's not a doctrine. It's a practice. This is something that is asked of men in the Western Church, the Latin Rite. And even there are some exceptions there. So that is something that's changeable. Another example, I think, for people of a certain age, older than you and I, so our parents probably, they went through the changes after Vatican II, where Mass had been for their entire lives, and in fact for centuries, celebrated, first of all, in the Latin language, right. And secondly, with the priest and the people facing the same direction. Right. The everyday way that it's put is the priest with his back to the people. Right. Well, then, pretty quickly, literally from the last Sunday of the church year in November of 1969 to the first Sunday of Advent in many places, all of a sudden, and obviously things had to be, but that's when the formal implementation happened of where now the Mass is said in the local language, by and large, so English in our case, and where the priest is now on the other side of the altar, a freestanding altar, and both the priest and the people are facing the altar together, so it looks like the priest is now facing the people. So people, again, thinking of people who grew up with that, all those changes, and as we just said, things like a celebration, well, that can change. That could theoretically change. So why can't we change the practice of the non-admission of women to the priesthood?
Because that's not a practice.
Because it's not a practice. Well, of course, so it's a doctrine, it's a teaching. Right. Well, some people might. Well, that's convenient. So the things that you don't want to change, we're just going to call those doctrines.
That is what it sounds like.
It does.
Isn't it? Yeah.
It totally. But that's not the case.
Because the doctrine is a doctrine because it was given to us by God.
It came down from Jesus and the apostles. Yeah. So the biblical roots, the basis for why the Catholic priesthood is reserved to men alone is because the priesthood originates, of course, with Jesus himself, but the first priests were the apostles. Right. And all of the apostles were men.
Yes.
Now, we know that there were women among Jesus' disciples. Right. We know that many times the women caught on to things that Jesus was saying before the men.
Right.
We know that Jesus had no compunction about overturning sort of cultural norms and expectations about how men and women interacted. And for me, most importantly, we also know that the greatest of Jesus' disciples was not Peter, was not Paul, was not John, the beloved disciple, the apostle. The greatest disciple of Jesus Christ then and for all time is his mom, Mary. And neither Mary, the mother of Jesus, nor Mary Magdalene, nor any of those faithful women who followed Jesus, Martha and Mary, none of them were chosen by Jesus as apostles. Right. And therefore, none of them were among the initial New Testament priesthood.
Right. Do you think it's possible? I'm going to throw another bomb.
Please.
Do you think it's possible that the apostles just wrote that out of the Bible?
Oh, okay. So that's a great question.
They just literally didn't write that in there because of the norms of the time.
Yeah, I want to answer that question in just a minute, but this is another prefatory remark I meant to say earlier. I think I'm glad you're raising this question because I do think it's important. I tell people all the time, I've said it before on Catholic Views, you hear me say it all the time in also the context. It's important to ask questions about our faith. And if you're wondering about something and if you can't figure it out, to ask somebody else. Yeah. So we shouldn't hide from controversial topics like this one.
That's why I wanted to talk about it.
Exactly. I know. So thank you for doing that. So is it possible that the authors of the New Testament, because they were all men, is it possible that they wrote that out? Theoretically, okay. If that's the case, then that means the Holy Spirit was not in charge of inspiring the Gospels.
True. Oh, I never thought of that.
So you're disbelieving in divine inspiration if that's the case. Secondly, though, if the apostles or if the authors of the New Testament, some of whom were apostles, were interested in removing anything that they didn't like, they left a lot of stuff in there that makes them look really bad.
Like the women discovering that Jesus wasn't in the tomb.
Exactly. You wouldn't do that. Like the apostles repeatedly looking stupid. Like Jesus, facepalm emoji.
Yeah.
Like they left all sorts of other things that make them look bad.
Right.
Peter, the greatest, the prince of the apostles, denying Jesus 3 times. If they were going to selectively, so again, setting aside the whole issue of divine inspiration or not aside, if the apostles were going to edit out things in their favor, they chose some funny things to leave in.
Right. All right. If you're just joining us, we're talking to Dr. Chris Burgwald about why only men can be priests.
Yep.
So, what is the biblical support?
So Jesus chose men only, and that goes to the heart of it. Okay. So Jesus only chose, and it's been the constant teaching of the church that this is in fact a teaching, that it's a doctrine.
Right.
Because the direction the priest faces, the language of the mass, the celibacy or not the priesthood, all those things have varied throughout history.
Right.
The first mass was in Aramaic.
Right.
And then Greek. Latin was not the dominant
From the beginning
language of the mass for centuries.
Right.
So all sorts of the things that are in fact practices and not doctrine have varied over time. The things that are doctrine, though, as you would expect, they don't change.
Right.
Because the nature of a doctrine is not that the church just made this up, but we've received, our conviction as Catholics is that every doctrine we believe was revealed by God through his church. So it's true. And if it was true 2,000 years ago, it's got to be true today. Otherwise, it's not a truth.
Right.
Truth doesn't change with the times.
Right.
It's constant.
Right. Okay. So if you are a Catholic who does not agree with this doctrine, who doesn't believe it, are you outside? Are you like not in communion with the church? What is can you disagree with the doctrine?
Yeah. So
and still be
yeah. So that's a good question. I'm going to approach that question this way. So it's always been a doctrine that's been taught by the church, but and I mentioned to you this before when we were talking about this as a topic. What we see throughout history, time and time again, is that there's a belief, a doctrine, a truth that's just normal, generally universally held, but never really investigated, never really questioned until it is. And so there might be a belief that's always held, and then for some reason somebody comes along who really starts to question and even challenge and like explicitly and publicly disagree and draw other people around, usually himself, disagreeing with this, what had always been believed. So one of the best examples of this is in the early church, where the question of Jesus' divinity. Christians always believed that Jesus was God, but there was a priest, and then he became a bishop, named Arius in Egypt. And Arius, for understandably, he wasn't like an evil mad scientist, but he started to question and then publicly teach that, in fact, Jesus was the greatest of God's creatures, but he was a creature and not the creator himself. Bad Arius. So what the church did is not come up first. The church did not come up with some what was some theological heavy lifting and really in-depth theological analysis and unpacking of the New Testament, like really going deep into theology to explain so that Arius would recant and accept. What the church said, the order was actually the opposite. No, this is what we've always believed. This is true. And that was definitively taught by the Council of Nicaea, from which we get the Nicene Creed. And then in the decades to follow, theologians, bishops, priests spent time trying to understand, okay, why is this true? We always believed it was true.
Oh, right.
We always believed it's true. Arius has come along. He's challenged it. We've affirmed, because we always believe, we've affirmed, no, this is true. But how do we answer these questions? How do we answer these real questions that Arius and others are asking? How do we explain and defend what we've always believed? So that sort of unpacking, explanation, elaboration of the always held doctrine comes after the doctrine is formally defined. So
where normally we were always doing the swapped.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what we
Opposite.
presume is, well, convince me and then I'll believe it.
Right.
Explain it to me and then I'll believe it. And that's a natural.
And that's probably good for a lot of things.
Yes.
But when it comes to what God tells us is
Exactly.
true, we have to look at it differently.
Exactly. So in whether it's Jesus' divinity or the priesthood being reserved to men alone, we know that it's true.
Right.
But this has never really been questioned throughout the history of the church until, frankly, the late 20th century.
Right.
I mean, that was just taken to be the case, and it started to be questioned. And I think we'll get into some of the why.
Why do you think that is?
I think that's because of the cultural reality of a society looking at the relationship between men and women.
Right.
So
I think there's and I said this before, and so I probably will throw another bomb. But I think that the feminist movement had a lot to do with it. Not entirely, but that certainly had some things to do with it.
Right, and what does it mean to be the part of the complexity here is when you say the feminist movement, what does that mean?
The desire for women to be equal in men, and equal meaning be able to do everything the same and everything.
Yeah, and that right there,
which is different than true feminism.
Right. Exactly. There's an authentic feminism, which the Catholic Church has always embraced and frankly championed.
Yes.
I mean, just real quick, in the early church, many of the early converts outside of Judaism, as the church grew and spread, many of the way that the gospel usually spread throughout nations like the Roman Empire, kingdoms and empires, actually, it appealed to women and the lower working classes and even slaves first, because it said that there's a fundamental dignity that every human being is, no matter their status in society. And there was definitely a patriarchalism in much of the civilized world.
Right.
So women were oftentimes the first to embrace the Catholic Christian faith. So this doctrine of priesthood for men alone was never really questioned until this sort of more modern twist on feminism. Well, to be honest, some of the early advocates of this sort of modern feminism, secular feminism, some of the early advocates and thinkers behind it were men.
Oh, sure.
So it wasn't like it was, just bad thinking women. It was also bad thinking men behind this. Anyway, so I think because of that, that's why, it seems unjust.
Right.
Unjust discrimination for priesthood to be for men alone. But the church has always said that. And I want to make sure, just because I know we're going to start running out of time, I want to make sure and make reference to one theologian in particular and her book.
Okay.
So Sister Sarah Butler, and I believe Sister's still alive. She's been a theologian. She was appointed to the International Theological Commission in the Vatican 10, 20 years ago now. Okay. She, in the 70s and through the 80s, was an advocate for women's ordination. She advocated that there be women priestesses.
Sure.
And then as she prayed and as she studied the issue more deeply, she changed her mind. And the book that was published a few years ago, written by her, The Catholic Priesthood and Women, A Guide to the Teaching of the Church.
Wow.
So what I said earlier about the definition comes, the affirmation comes, and then the explanation and the answering the questions. That's what's happening. That's what's happened, to be honest, with the question of a male-only priesthood. So as I said, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s, a lot of questions about this. In 1996, John Paul II wrote a relatively short document, Ordinatio Sacerdotales, in which he said that and sort of explained in a definitive way that the priesthood is for men alone. And he didn't do a lot. I mean, John Paul II with a lot of things would really do that unpacking. But this document was sort of just the bare bones affirmation, and it was left to others. And he did this to some degree, but others like Sister Sarah Butler to explain the why. Yeah. And this goes back to another question you asked earlier. That affirmation that JP2 made in Ordinatio Sacerdotales is to be held infallibly.
Okay.
So it is a level of it's dogma that the priesthood is for men alone. So going to your question about what if I have questions? So there's a difference between me, like I just don't understand this. Okay, that's one thing. But is there an openness there? Like, I don't get this, but I'm going along, and it's sort of internally wrestling with it is
Right.
one thing. And we're called to give, though, internal assent to everything that the church formally teaches. So I think if we can say, okay, I know the church teaches it, so I'm going to accept it, but I'm really asking questions, that's totally fine.
Yeah.
Where it gets into more problematic areas is where I reject this teaching.
Right.
To be a Catholic means to accept everything that God has revealed to us through His church. Again, it's one thing to to recognize that we struggle with certain teachings,
Right.
to ponder why are they true. It's another thing to just dissent,
Right.
to reject
Right.
the church's teaching, because with that you're rejecting the church's authority. And it gets a lot messier when we go that route.
Right. We aren't going to have time to get to this, but one of the things that I wanted to talk about, maybe we can put this on Ignition or something sometime, but is like should women feel bad and feel slighted? And what is the role of women and the important role of women in the church? So we don't really have time to get to that. So I don't know if that's...
Yeah, so I think my answer, should women feel bad? No, I understand why many of them do.
Right.
I mean, I pulled up a letter that I had sent to a woman in our diocese a number of years ago, and she was just really struggling with the church's teaching on this question. And I kind of walked through some of the things that I said biblically. Look at Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene. We see the exalted... So we tend to, I'll say this when I have time to unpack it. We tend to equate status in the church with power.
Right.
And that's not. Right. Mary.
Yeah, we need to talk about that. In
Mother Teresa.
Yeah.
I mean, probably the most well-known and in some way the most effective evangelist of the 20th century. You can make an argument for JP2, but you can make just as much of an argument for Mother Teresa, who was, quote unquote, just a nun.
Right.
Not a priest, not a bishop, not a pope, just a nun in India.
Right. Yeah. Very good stuff, Dr. B. Sorry we didn't have time to get more in there, but 20 minutes is short.
Amen, sister.
All right. Thanks a lot.
You bet.
All right. If you want to find out more about our diocese or find out Mass times, check out our podcasts or Bishop's homilies, you can find us at sfcatholic.org anytime. That's it for us today. Hope you'll join us again next week for more Catholic Views.